Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the Guyanese, both at home and in the diaspora. And this year, 2024, we commemorate the 60th anniversary of the greatest atrocity in the history of this country. That is the disturbances, which essentially was a period of murderous terrorism launched by the PPP's hurricane of protest uh, in order to prevent the holding of elections in December 1964. So 1964 is very important because it casts a shadow over the rest of Guyanese history. And today I would deal with the aftermath of the hurricane. The hurricane was launched in January, and like a storm, like any hurricane storm. And although it subsided by December, the killings went on, the sabotage and arson went on into 1965. But let us look at the aftermath of the hurricane. A bloody year, and I think this poor country, sustained injuries, which have caused agony for 6 decades after that. And don't forget that the hurricane occurred after 7 years of the PPP's tenure of office. They went into office in 1957. And by 1964, they'd been there for 7 years. So the damage done was widespread. And it was a good thing that in December 1964, the PNC-UF coalition entered office and brought about some change, significant change. And I think all Guyanese should be aware of the benefits of that event in the 7th of December 1964, when the population went to the polls and elected the People's National Congress and United Force, which formed the coalition. When we look at the cost of the disturbances, the official figures, at least for the duration of the GAU strike, the Guyana Agriculture Workers Union strike, 176 people officially were murdered, 176 people in that 165-day strike. There were 1,000 injured, 15,000 were displaced or made homeless. But not necessarily homeless, they were driven out of the places where they used to live before. And about 1,500 houses were burnt, deliberately burnt, and thousands of acres of sugarcane were burnt. But that is only part of the tragedy. I think the greatest damage has been done to the psyche of the Guyanese nation as we were all preparing for independence. But we entered independence in a state of emergency, and in some cases, almost a state of hatred. But let us look at some of what I would call the indicators of the damage that was done by the hurricane of protest, the disturbances. In terms of economic development, a British government commission of inquiry deemed British Guyana to be statistically insolvent. That is, by 1964, the PNC and United Force took over a country, a government, which was insolvent. That is not guesswork, that's not political propaganda. That is an official study of the financial state of British Guyana after 7 years of PPP administration. Secondly, in terms of political and social division, what used to be electoral rivalry, maybe even robust electoral rivalry, up to the elections of 1961, after that it became murderous, it became hostile, and of course it led to violence. And since then, since 1964, every general elections you can expect to be accompanied by some form of violence, right up to the 6th of March 2020, when PPP rioters stoned a school bus in West Berbice. It seems that elections bring out the worst in our people, particularly the people associated with terrorism in the PPP. After the elections of December 1964, PPP adopted a perpetual policy of non-cooperation. Um, Society being badly damaged by violence of the terrorist period, and social cohesion was in tatters. And I would say confidence in the institutions of the state, particularly the government, was badly weakened. People had very little faith in government. Public security was powerless. As you know, the British Army had been deployed in Guyana for about a decade. In fact, since 1953, there was a continuous presence of British troops in Guyana. There were about 18 British regiments over the period 1953 to 1966 when we got independence. So we were in a state of occupation, and much of it was to protect the population against PPP terrorism. Because even in 1954, 70 years ago, it was the PPP terrorists who blew up Queen Victoria's statue on her birthday. So the British government knew what to expect, and that is why British regiments were based here for such a long period in the 1960s, um, basically from 1953-54 to 1966. Um, so in 1964, after the hurricane had started to subside, British troops were still here, but arson continued. Sometimes you could look in the sky, place on the coastline, and see the sugarcane fields burning. Bombings continued, and the targets were all government buildings, post offices. Those days we had railway running from Rosignol to Georgetown and from Breeden Hoop to Parika. Bombings would take place at train stations, sabotage of aqueducts in the estates, murders continued. So public security did not cease, or public insecurity did not cease with the holding of elections on the 7th of December 1964. In terms of public education, a big concern of mine and yours, I'm sure, that stagnated. Most of the schools, the primary schools, had been built by the Christian churches. And if you ever went to school in the countryside, you'll see these were like whole bark rooms. There were no walls. There was no way of keeping out the sun from one class to another class. The toilets were latrines. People had to leave the school building to go to the backyard. Poor utilities. Some schools never got electricity. So despite the 7 years of PPP rule, public education was sorely neglected. And the few secondary schools, as you know, many private teachers set up their own secondary schools because there were not enough places in the what they call the Six Sisters, St. Stanislaus, St. Rose's, Queen's College, Bishop's High School, Borby's High School, and St. Joseph's. The Six Sisters, they're all set up by the churches. So the government, the PPP government from 1957 to 1964 was really doing very little in terms of both elementary and secondary education. And it took the PNCUF coalition after 64 to start moving education forward again. Those of you who are over 60 years old would know what public infrastructure was like. Most of the roads in this country, the coastal roads particularly, were made of burnt earth. Sometimes when you drove through the countryside, you'd see these huge pyramids of clay, mud, and they would burn slowly until they became, hard, and they would use that to make up the road. The result is that as the vehicles travel along the roads, they would be crushed, and this red dust would would come up like clouds, and of course, during bad weather, you had a lot of potholes, but it was agony to drive from New Amsterdam to Skeldon or from Rossignol to Georgetown. Um, uh, the roads that some of you see today, those roads are built by the People's National Congress, um, administration after 1964. The international airport, it used to be called Atkinson Field. Of course, it's now called Chedi Jagan um, International Airport. But it was burnt down in 1969 under the PPP administration and it was never rebuilt. It was never rebuilt. Um, After 1969, there used to be a little uh, building that was constructed by the United States base at Atkinson Field, grossly inadequate, a one flat bungalow, I can call it. And the PPP had no interest in rebuilding the airport, and the airport on its present site, the airport terminal, was built by the People's National Congress. So much wasn't happening in any field other than the PPP, which did not have a focus on public services and public utilities and public administration. So we can look, my friends, at the social division, which I believe is the greatest harm caused to the Guyanese nation by the PPP's hurricane of protest. They've never doubted that because they know when they go to the book, the Western Trial, they see those are the identical words that the founder or the leader of the party in 1964 used, hurricane of protest. But that hurricane was a social catastrophe. The violence that was inflicted on this poor country in 1964 damaged public trust in government. Government that was supposed to be protecting the people was in fact perpetrating violence. Instead of preventing violence, they were the ones who were perpetrating violence. And those of you who are fond of history would remember that image of Sidney King there with a black cape sitting down in a vigil outside Government House, calling on the government to call a study or to proclaim a state of emergency while people were being murdered in West Demerara. So we were badly divided. And what was before, just differences of opinion became antagonistic. I feel that the ethnic polarization in our country was aggravated by the disturbances. And in one very serious case, an organization calling itself the Union of Indian Organizations issued a statement on the 16th of January 1965. That is just 1 month after the new administration entered office. 1 month. The new administration was sworn in on the 14th of December 1964. And on the 16th of January 1965, the Union of Indian Organizations issued a statement pressing demands for partition of the country. And many people blame others for partition, but this is the only organization I know at that time that actually called for partition. What I know is that another very prominent politician said, if the races can't live together, let them live apart. But this is the only organization on record on the 16th of January 1965, which called for partition. And it's called the Union of Indian Organizations. I'm not saying this out of any prejudice, I'm saying out of the historical fact. So you can see, my friends, that what started off as a political ploy, a pretext to prevent elections being held, became the source of ethnic violence. And many villages which were peaceful mixed communities, um, degenerated into internal antagonism and hostility. Some people had to leave the villages where they were born, where they grew up, and go to other areas. This is the first time we heard about internal migration in British Guyana. And ethnic organizations started to spring up. Many people were conscious of the fact that political leaders came from different ethnic groups. But this is the first time we had political parties being formed purely on the basis of ethnic or racial rights, um, purely on the basis of religious preferences. It had never really happened before. People appeal to the whole nation, but this time people are appealing to specific groups. So the social damage caused by the disturbances um, was very difficult to eradicate. We therefore find ourselves in British Guiana in December 1964, facing the challenge of reconstruction. There was no civil war, but there was extensive damage. There was extensive dislocation. And I think that every facet of life in Guyana was affected. And it fell to the People's National Congress and United Force Coalition in that post-disturbances period to rectify or correct the problems which had affected Guyana so badly. At this time, my friends, I wish to look at 5 areas of what I would call our reconstruction period. The most important was the need for reconciliation. And we had a prudent administration, both PNC and United Force, and implemented measures to bring about reconciliation among the parties and among the different ethnic groups. And this is the first time in Guyanese history that there was official recognition for the Hindu and Muslim holidays that we enjoy now. Prior to 1965, prior to the coalition entering office, Diwali and Phagwa were not recognized as national, as official holidays. Eid and Yom Nabi were not recognized officially. We only recognized Christian holidays. But as a significant move towards reconciliation, the PNC-UF coalition introduced, you know, if you can call it party, but there was official recognition at the national level of Islamic and Hindu holidays. An ombudsman was appointed, so people could make their complaints about government officials to the ombudsman. This might have been one of the first English-speaking Caribbean countries to have an ombudsman. And we also had, much more significant, a commission of inquiry by the ICJ into the public service. People complained about the imbalances in the public service, so the premier at the time said, let's have an inquiry. And the inquiry established what we all knew, that there was a tendency for people of African descent to go into the public services, into the civil service, into the security forces, the police force. And that was a fact of life. And there are clear historical reasons. There was no hidden hand pushing, one set of people into business and another set of people into service. And ICJ reported what they saw and attempts that we made to deal with the recommendations made by the ICJ. So this is one of the measures. This could have been done, by the PPP administration between 1957 and 1964 if they felt serious about it. But the PNC-UF felt serious, and in 1965 they invited the ICJ to come and produce a report, and the report is there for all to see. And they reported factually about what they saw. But one of the things the ICJ report mentioned that nobody speaks about, And it seems like a sort of one paragraph comment. And it said that the solution to the problem, if it is felt that an African policeman has harmed a citizen, the solution is not to replace him by an Indian policeman. The solution is to replace him by an efficient policeman of any ethnicity. People don't read that part of the report. So it is not a matter of putting an Indian in place of an African or vice versa. The ICJ report said put an efficient policeman to remove an inefficient policeman. But nobody speaks about that. They speak about race. So the reconciliation was the important first index of reconstruction that we can measure the performance of the PNC coalition. The second thing is the public infrastructure reconstruction. And as I told you a little while ago, the coastal railway was basically made up of burnt earth. And the PPP had 7 years to fix it and didn't fix it. And the road you see now between Skeldon and New Amsterdam, between Rosignol and Georgetown, and between Reed and Hope and Parika was essentially built by the PNC-UF coalition. The airport you see now on the site was a replacement for the airport, the international airport, that was burnt down in 1959. PPP never found it prudent to repair the airport. Oh, they were very anxious to stick the name of Dr. Jagan on the new airport, but they stayed with that old airport that burned down ashes for 5 years without doing anything. The bridges over the Kanji, those of you who are from East Berbice Quarantine would know that the Kanji Bridge was like it was created by some schoolboys with a mechano set. But that bridge there was built by the PNC. The highway from Suzdijk to Linden, which was severely criticized. But now a lot of gold miners, a lot of people move. If you're going to Lethem or if you're going to anywhere in Region 8, you go through the very highway that was built by the PNC UF coalition. In terms of drainage and irrigation, if you had to drive from East Berbice to East Demerara, you had to pass through West Berbice. And you would want to know if you were driving through a lagoon during the rainy weather. It was so bad. You'd see sometimes 3 or 4 cows and a little bit of dry land surrounded by water. And much of that was corrected by the construction of the ADA, MMA ADA water control scheme. So you can see that the elections of 1964 really brought a completely different way of governing Guyana into this country. There was also the question of resettlement. Because of the PPP violence, many people were driven from their homes. And the coalition, the PNC-UF coalition, invited Sir Stanley Gomes, a former Chief Justice, to head the National Rehabilitation Committee. Think of it. The PNC-UF coalition invited Sir Stanley Gomes to head the National Rehabilitation Committee to resettle persons who had been displaced in the disturbances. And this was done as early as April 1965. So there was a recovery program. And the premier at the time spent a lot of time out of office meeting the people, practicing what he called consultative democracy, finding out what the people actually thought, the people who had suffered, the people who were displaced, the people who had endured a year of PPP terror, particularly in the countryside, a country which had been torn apart by violence. And he walked the ground and spoke to people. He tried to promote greater cultural diversity, to promote social equality, and to restore normal economic activity. And luckily, over a period of time, the sugar industry recovered from the arson and sabotage and the strikes. The bauxite industry recovered and production started to become normal. So what we see in Guyana in 1964 December was a new way of thinking, a new approach to governance. This is not for one party, but we started to see ourselves as a nation. And this is the frame of mind with which we approach independence. Unfortunately, we were still in a state of emergency, and many members, 32 members of the PPP, including the deputy premier, had to be detained without trial at a special section of Her Majesty's Penal Settlement at Masaroon. And eventually, the detainees were released when it was felt that they couldn't be any great danger to the country. But in the meantime, in less than a year after uh, the elections were held, we knew that the British Army couldn't stay here, and the government started to plan for the establishment of the Ghana Defense Force, which, in theory and in practice, was established on the 1st of November, just 11 months after the elections. It was established on the 1st of November 1965. And of course, the British Army started to prepare to withdraw. So the type of disorder that we saw in British Guiana during well, worse than 1964, really from 1954, after the PPP was removed from office, with all of the sabotage and arson and the murders, this now became the responsibility of the Guyana Defense Force. And eventually the British Army had to be withdrawn. So at the time of independence, of the independence night, 25th of May 1966, um, less than 2 years after the PNC-UF coalition entered office, we still saw a country in which the key positions of the state were in the hands of foreigners, still in the hands of foreigners. The chief of staff of the GDF was a foreigner. The governor of the Bank of Guyana was a foreigner. The vice chancellor of the University of Guyana was a foreigner. The head of the Catholic Church was a foreigner. The head of the Anglican Church was a foreigner. The people in charge of the bauxite industries were foreigners. The people in charge of the sugar industries were foreigners. The people in charge of the banks were foreigners. So at the time of independence, the night of independence, the dawn of independence, we were still essentially in the hands of the same people who were running the country before. So it was a tremendous task. And this task had to be achieved or performed in the face of persistent opposition by the PPP. PPP refused to leave office in December 1960, even after the election results had been published. The Queen had to issue a special order authorizing the removal of the Premier from office. Um, the PPP refused to participate in the independence constitution talks. So the constitution was drafted and produced and approved without the PPP's participation. They refused to participate in the parliament, what is now called the National Assembly, because before that was the Legislative Assembly. And they started to boycott, the parliamentary session. But in the meantime, the PPP was suffering from its own internal contradictions. One, the deputy premier had started to pull out. Another senior member of the youth organization had started to leave. So there was a lot of internal dissension inside the PPP. They didn't know where to go. And they resorted to violence instead of contributing to national development. So from the start, their position is not, okay, we have lost, we will now contribute to building the nation. They continue to resist. And unfortunately, that resistance was underlined by a continuing program of terror in the countryside. there were still arson, there were still bombings, there was still murder. And even though 7th of December was a very important day in terms of the history of Guyana, it brought an end to the violence and started the infrastructural and the social and the political reconstruction of our country. You know, it was resisted all the way by the People's Progressive Party. And you can still see in the PPP's behavior a refusal to cooperate with any plan, any institution, any organization, which is not of their own making, which is not of their own design. But nevertheless, we embarked on the road to independence in the face of opposition by the PPP, in the face of non-participation by the PPP. And Guyana should be very thankful that we got a start in nation building by a coalition led by the People's National Congress and the United Force in 1964, December. 7th of December, mark the date. So my friends, this is the last program on the disturbances, but I'll come back to disturbances because some serious things happened during the disturbances. And during the course of this year, 2024, which is the 6th anniversary year of the disturbances, and we will commemorate some significant events which we should never forget, but also which we should never allow to happen again. We have to protect our democracy. We have to protect our social cohesion for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. Future generations will never have to go through what our generation went through in 1964. The PPP inspired campaign of terrorism called the Hurricane of Protest. Never again, never again. May God bless you and look after your children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Let us cooperate for the young. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to work together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Each man must